So it's exactly a month since the Pahalgam terror attack. India, of course, carrying out Operation Sindoor earlier this month and drawing some new red lines that terror will not go unpunished. There will be a proportionate cost that will be imposed on the enemy. And of course, there are a range of options that are sub-nuclear, some of which India carried out through the course of Operation Sindoor. Are we looking at a new normal? That's what the government of India, that's what the Prime Minister today said in his address in Bikaner. But what are the red lines? What is the template of this new normal? And how will India enforce this new normal were there to be another attack some months or years down the line? Professor John Mearsheimer is with the Political Science Department at the University of Chicago, one of the world's foremost international relations experts. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us. You're joining us on the day exactly a month since the attack that happened on the 22nd of April, in which 26 Indians were killed. India, of course, took reprisal action through the military operation that was carried out earlier this month. What is your assessment now, a month in, as to whether India has created a new paradigm or a new security doctrine when it comes to dealing with these acts of terror by the actions it took earlier this month?
That India has created a new paradigm or a new model for dealing with this problem. This is a long-standing problem, and India is, I think, responding today much the way it has responded in the past and is likely to respond in the future. I don't think India wants a major war with Pakistan, and therefore it engages in escalation on the lower rungs of the escalation ladder. And the problem that India faces is that it can't dominate on the lower rungs or even the middle range rungs of the escalation ladder. Furthermore, the United States got deeply involved in this, or at least it claims that it got deeply involved in this, which is not to India's advantage, because India doesn't want it to be a situation where the United States comes in and tells India what to do. But it looks to some people like that's what has happened. And furthermore, from India's point of view, it doesn't want to be treated as an equal with Pakistan. India views itself, understandably, as a greater power than Pakistan. But in a conflict like this, India and Pakistan end up getting treated equally. So I think from a military point of view, it's a standoff.
I do want to talk about the U.S. role, because there's been a lot of disappointment with the intervention of leaders like Mr. Vance, the Vice President, the Secretary of State. But the disappointment, I suspect, is greatest with President Trump, not least because of his public pronouncements, including one yesterday when he was meeting the South African president, I think, in the White House, where he said, "Look, I told these two countries, let's do some trade." There are two parts to this problem. One is, as you said, equating India and Pakistan, in a sort of even keel. Clearly, India doesn't think it needs to be equated or hyphenated with Pakistan. And second, the whole thing started because of a terrorist attack. India's response was in response to that terrorist attack. For the President of the United States to say, "I said, let's do some trade," equating trade to response to a terror attack has also left real sour taste in the mouth. How would you see both of these aspects?
I completely understand the Indian perspective, but it's what you would expect from President Trump. Diplomacy is not his strong suit. He just says whatever he thinks. He doesn't think carefully about the diplomatic consequences of his rhetoric. And even more importantly, he likes to claim responsibility for every success in international politics. So he's come into this situation and he's basically treating India and Pakistan if they're minor players who were squabbling. And he, the great Donald Trump, came in and put both of them at rest by telling them that he would give them more trade if they stopped fighting with each other. This, of course, is not what happened, but it's the way President Trump views the world. He always sees himself as being responsible for good outcomes. And the end of the conflict here was a good outcome. It didn't escalate further. So he's claiming credit. And I can understand why the Indians are deeply unhappy about this. And the Pakistanis, on the other hand, are happy about Trump's rhetoric.
How much of that rushing in to claim credit for this ceasefire, as he claims he mediated, which India, of course, is completely denying, is because of his apparent failures in finding any kind of peace, either in Russia, Ukraine, or for that matter, in the war that's going on between Israel and Hamas in Gaza?
I agree 100% with what you said. I think that if you look at Trump's performance on the foreign policy front, with regard to settling the war in Ukraine, improving relations with Russia, coming up with some sort of meaningful peace agreement with Iran to shut down that crisis, and ending the Gaza genocide, he's failed on every count. And then you can put on top of that the problem with tariffs. It's quite clear that he's had to backtrack on tariffs. It's quite clear that tariffs are going to have a negative effect on the American economy. So he is, I believe, in political trouble. And I believe the situation only gets worse with the passage of time. So in a situation like that, you would expect Trump to come in and claim all the credit for shutting down the conflict between India and Pakistan, even though that's not true.
So just expanding this, on the one side, on the Pakistan side, you clearly have this alignment going on between China and Pakistan. Much of the weaponry that Pakistan used and currently uses happens to be Chinese. So it's clear there is a degree of strategic alignment happening there. India, of course, had put its eggs in the American basket, as it were, but given Trump's comments and the degree of great, I wouldn't say anger, but certainly frustration that is shown up here in India, where does that leave India? Because India was counting on America's support to take India's side in the event of a clash, a flare-up either with Pakistan or with China. On that side, there clearly seems to be a strategic alignment. Here, I'm not so sure anymore.
Well, I think that there's no question that on the Pakistani side, relations between China and Pakistan are quite good. It's obvious that the Chinese are providing the Pakistani with excellent weaponry and are likely to provide them with even better weaponry moving forward. And then if you look at the India-US side, I think there's no question that India is dealing with the United States that is not the most reliable partner. India is not the only country in the world that is having trouble with the United States, as you well know. All you have to do is look at relations between the United States and Europe, and even relations in East Asia between the United States and South Korea and the United States and Japan. The United States, to some extent, acts like a rogue elephant these days. And if you're allied with the United States, it's very difficult sometimes to figure out how to move forward. And I think that given that President Trump is just in the early stages of a 4-year term, this is going to be a significant problem for India moving forward. I think it's natural, given the structure of the international situation today, for India to be allied with the United States. They don't have to be allied in a formal treaty, but there has to be, given the structure of the international system, there has to be a reasonably close relationship between India and the United States. And that's why we're in the situation we have today. But again, when you're dealing with the United States, let's be honest, you're dealing with a country that is something of a rogue elephant when it comes to diplomacy.
I do want to talk about, again, another aspect which has led to a degree of concern here in India, and that is, after India conducted the operation on the 7th of May, there was a bit of quiet for the next day, but on the 9th, particularly after the IMF sanctioned the latest bailout for Pakistan, it was on the night between the 9th and the 10th that the biggest military-to-military confrontation happened between India and Pakistan. It was almost like Pakistan was waiting for the IMF to make that announcement, and then it got like a green signal to go ahead and do what it did. And India, of course, responded. And the concern has always been here in India, not just with the US and these multilateral institutions, but why the West does not hold Pakistan to the standard that it holds all other countries when it comes to terrorism.
I think the West has a mixed record when it comes to terrorism. I mean, if you look at what's happening in Syria, the West, and here we're even talking about the United States, has developed reasonably close relations with a leader in Syria who was a former terrorist who headed a terrorist organization that specifically targeted Americans. And now the Americans are acting differently. So if you're expecting the West to have a consistent policy on how to deal with terrorism, I think you're going to be disappointed because the United States and its allies vary in how they think about terrorism. And I think in this particular case, the fact that there was a terrorist attack that precipitated this whole crisis did not ultimately matter that much to the West. You can say that's wrong, but I do think that that's what happened. And then once the conflict began to spiral, once you began to move up the escalation ladder, the fact that it was a terrorist attack that initiated the conflict mattered for little, and all everybody cared about was shutting down the conflict. And this is what leads to the present concern in India that the West is not paying attention to the fact that terrorism is what precipitated the crisis.
But you know, the utility of Pakistan, one could understand till 2021, 2022, when the United States eventually withdrew from Afghanistan. You needed Pakistan. In the 20-year war on terror, you needed Pakistan because there was military movements from Pakistan into Afghanistan. You needed strategic depth to control Afghanistan. But for the last 3 or 4 years, America in particular has not needed. The utility of Pakistan has come down quite substantially. And yet, when this flare-up happened, like you said, India and Pakistan got rehyphenated or got put back on the same plate. What is the utility that Pakistan brings to the table that the West does not want to call out its behavior, either on terror or look at what's happened just now? I mean, they've promoted a failed general to the rank of field marshal after a failed military operation.
Well, I've thought about this question, which is a very important question you're asking. I think that if you're the United States and you recognize that China is a peer competitor and you're interested in containing China, there's no question that India is of the greatest importance in South Asia, no question. But then you have to think about how you deal with countries like Myanmar and countries like Pakistan. And if you're the United States, what you want to do is go to great lengths to peel Pakistan away from China. You want to drive a wedge between Pakistan and China. You want to do everything you can to make sure there's not a tight relationship between those two countries. So I think what you see now and what you'll see over time is that the United States will certainly want to have good relations with India, despite the Trump administration's diplomatic blundering. India is our most important ally in South Asia. But I also think you're going to see the United States work hard over time to maintain good relations with Pakistan, again, to peel it away from China. And I think you'll see a similar situation with other countries like Myanmar.
But Professor, the interesting thing is I think the opposite also seems to be just as true, if not truer, which is that China is using Pakistan to keep India boxed in this sort of semi-war or this semi-boiling situation with these terror attacks and India's punitive reprisals, thereby stifling India's own position or India's ambition, certainly, to try and become a counterweight to China.
I agree 100%. I think it's in China's interest to make sure that the conflict between India and Pakistan remains in place. I don't think the Chinese want a war. And I would bet that the Chinese were interested in preventing a war in this recent crisis. But the Chinese want significant tensions between India and Pakistan so that the Indian military has to devote a lot of its resources and a lot of its strategic thinking to dealing with Pakistan, which gives China an advantage in the Himalayas and gives China an advantage in the Indian Ocean. So I think all of what is going on here with regard to China and Pakistan is not good for India.
One final word, just because we had this just earlier this week, this long 2.5-hour phone call between Presidents Trump and Putin. Where do you see that moving? Because everybody thought, President Putin would agree to a ceasefire, freeze the territories, no NATO membership for Ukraine. He was basically getting everything he wanted, but it doesn't seem like we're getting any closer to either a ceasefire or forget about a permanent end to this war.
The Russians have made it unequivocally clear from the beginning that there would be no ceasefire before there was an agreement on the final terms of a settlement. So what the Americans are doing here, and the Europeans and even the Ukrainians, I don't understand at all. The Russians are not interested in a ceasefire. They're interested in coming up with a meaningful peace agreement. And there cannot be a meaningful peace agreement unless you agree to Russia's terms. The Russians are unequivocal on what has to be done to satisfy their demands. And we meaning the West, and especially the United States, don't seem to understand that the Russians are not going to make concessions on the important issues that they really care about. And therefore, Trump is just tilting at windmills. He's wasting his time. And this has become clear in recent days. But it's not going to improve. The situation is not going to improve. We're not going to come close to getting a settlement in Ukraine unless we accept Russian demands. And I do not believe we will do that. And the Europeans and the Ukrainians certainly will not do that. And the end result, in my opinion, is that this one is going to be settled on the battlefield. And there, I think the Russians are going to win. It's going to be an ugly victory, and you're going to get a frozen peace, and that will be the future of the Russia-Ukraine situation. But the idea that Donald Trump is going to settle this one is not a serious argument. He does not have the diplomatic skills at all and does not understand the problem. And furthermore, even if he did, he could not make the concessions to the Russians that the Russians are demanding.
All right, Professor John Mearsheimer, as always, a pleasure speaking with you, sir. Thank you so much for joining us here on CNN News 18 and on Prostax. Thank you.
You're welcome.